Okay, let's make a start. Hello, everyone. I'm Asaf Siniver. I'm the chair of the Diplomatic Studies section. This is the first monthly webinar of the year that we're hosting. And so I'd like to welcome you all to this workshop on teaching practical diplomacy skills. I'm delighted to be joined today by Nicholas Kralev, who is the founding executive director of the Washington International Diplomatic Academy, which is an independent organization providing practical training in diplomacy. A bit about Nicholas. Nicholas is a former Financial Times and Washington Times correspondent. Over the years, he has covered and accompanied several US Secretaries of State, including Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Madeleine Albright on their travels around the world. Nicholas' books include America's Other Army, the US Foreign Service in 21st Century Diplomacy, and more recently, earlier this year, I believe, with Cambridge University Press, Diplomatic Trade Graph, which is the first ever practical diplomacy textbook. And today, Nicholas will probably spend roughly 40 to 45 minutes sharing with us his insights about teaching and sharing diplomatic skills, which will leave us plenty of time for hopefully a very meaningful discussion and questions in the second half of this workshop. So without further ado, over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you. I am very happy to be with all of you, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the introduction, Asaf, and good to meet you on the screen, and look forward to doing so in person in a couple of weeks or 4 weeks, whatever it is. Okay, so you heard a bit about my background, and I want to start with why I'm doing this. Okay, well, I think we probably would agree that the world is a mess, right? So I'm coming to this from the outside in. I'm zooming into the subject we are discussing today. I think all of us care about what's happening in the world. We all, in some way, are connected to the field of international relations or political science. And so what happens now and in the future, I assume, is a concern for all of us. So I always say the diplomacy is the world's best hope. And I have come to the conclusion that much of the trouble that has been going on is due to ineffective diplomacy. There are many other reasons. And let's face it, when was the world really tranquil? Never, right? So there's always something. But it just, now that I'm older and I spent all these years witnessing firsthand the conduct of American diplomacy and having been now to 107 countries, I am better prepared, I think, to draw conclusions. And so when I examine how governments respond to either crises or just developments in their country and in other countries, I really believe that with more skillful diplomacy, things would be better. So then what is the next thing connected to effective diplomacy or the effectiveness of diplomacy? It's the people who do it, right? It's the people who practice it. So then my next question or sort of area to explore is the capabilities of the practitioners. Who are those people? How qualified are they? What mechanisms do governments have in place to make sure that their current diplomats and the next generation of diplomats, in fact, are ready to perform the duties and responsibilities of daily diplomacy? And to me, that is connected with the issue of diplomacy as a profession. So we had UNGA last week was the high level week, right? At the UN, the General Assembly. It continues now, but most of the heads of state or government spoke last week. The people in New York call that week the largest diplomatic gathering in the world for the year. And in reality, the majority of the people there are not diplomats. They're politicians or other officials, but they're not diplomats. And so this question about, is diplomacy a real profession, seems to come up quite a bit. And of course, the diplomats say, yes, of course it is. And many other people say so too. But when you drill down and you ask them what they understand as a real profession, then people are not as confident in their answer. And as I don't know where all of you come from, I don't know if there are any Americans, but probably many of you know that 1/3 of American ambassadors are political appointees with no qualifications to practice diplomacy. So you're supposed to run an embassy having never worked at an embassy. Other countries do it as well. I mean, Britain, I always gave Britain as an example of maybe 1 or 2 at a time. And unfortunately, that's no longer the case. I'm going to several European countries in the next 4 weeks, and at least one of them has a new ambassador, a fairly new ambassador, who has never worked at an embassy before. And he may be brilliant. I actually probably will meet him. But so he has worked at the FCDO in London, but he's never worked at an embassy. He was appointed ambassador. Again, I don't want to talk, speak ill of people I've never met. I'm just, in principle, I think it's a terrible idea to have an ambassador who's never worked at an embassy. So the question of professionalizing diplomacy is what I'm very interested in. And one of the reasons I founded our academy is precisely that. I would like for diplomacy to be accepted as a real profession, because I don't think it is now. Even if a president of the United States says, like Obama did, that diplomacy is very important and all this, very nice things about it, at the end of the day, by their actions, they demonstrate that they think that diplomacy is so easy, anybody can wing it. Just pick anyone who is relatively smart or successful in whatever other field, and they can practice diplomacy, and you just throw them there and make them ambassador. To me, that doesn't say or show that president or these politicians think that diplomacy is a real profession. Okay. So I just wanted to show you, this is from my book. So these numbers, so the numbers that may have changed slightly are the number of missions. The ballpark of the personnel is still the same. So I am very concerned that really no country has enough diplomats. Career diplomat, foreign service, right? Foreign service officers, we call them in the United States and in a few other countries. A number of missions, China and the United States have been competing. The US used to have by far the highest number of missions, and embassies, consulates general, multilateral missions, and other posts. China made a point of catching up, and they did. In fact, when I was finishing the book, the US posts were, I think, 275 or 276. And China's were 279. Now we've caught up to China. First China caught up with us, and then we caught up with them. Anyway, but look at this. India has 850 career diplomats. Are you kidding me? Seriously? With over 1 billion people? Right? So given the number of missions, you see there how many missions India has. This means that in most missions, so they've got almost 200 missions, so fewer than 4 diplomats per mission. But the reality is that in London, Washington, and other big embassies, they have probably a dozen or 2 dozen, and then in many countries they've got maybe 1 or 2, right? Brazil, 1,500. Anyway, so you get the point there, and it's just not. I don't know what these politicians are thinking. I don't. To me, this is so obvious that you would want to deal with a problem before it erupts into conflict. And so I'm not going to be sort of preaching to the choir for too long. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage and the context of the actual topic of teaching practical diplomacy skills. Now, in terms of the US numbers, we do have the largest foreign service in the world by far, right? We've got about 8,000 foreign service officers or diplomats. The foreign service is a total of about 13,000, but 8,000 of them are foreign service officers. But that's 0.6% of the armed forces, right? Nobody is saying they should be equal, but 162 times more, I think that's overly excessive. I just did a tautology there, overly excessive, but to make the point. Abroad, where your diplomat should be the largest force you have, right? Force, so to say. And look at that number. We have 170,000 uniformed military people overseas compared to 6,800 diplomats. It's just, how are we supposed to deal with the world as it is and possibly make it better, as some want? Okay. The next piece, so for me, these are the two biggest pieces. How many career diplomats do we have, and how good are they, right? So the state of training is absolutely abysmal. Now, the system globally is such that there really isn't a way currently to prepare someone for a career in diplomacy until they, in fact, become diplomats. To me, that's also absurd, by the way. Now, academia, of course, can teach certain things, right? But unfortunately, even with a degree in international relations, you don't necessarily, you cannot necessarily practice diplomacy without proper training, right? And so one of the reasons I wanted to do this today was to perhaps share some ideas and have a discussion with you after I finish with my monologue about teaching practical diplomacy skills in academia, and whether that's possible, whether that's daydreaming, or whether it's even advisable to do. But particularly at the graduate level, or postgraduate, as some of you call it, I think there will be a value in this. All right. So we have a system in which you cannot be trained or acquire the skills needed to practice diplomacy on a daily basis until you, in fact, join the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the State Department, whatever it is, right? Your foreign service. And that logically would mean that you get solid training when you join the foreign service, which is absolutely not the case. Other than Germany, I don't know of another country that comes even close to proper, substantive, comprehensive entry-level training. It's, for example, at our Foreign Service Institute, we have 6 weeks of orientation. They call it orientation. They don't even pretend to be training because it's an orientation into the bureaucracy of the State Department, right? So I call it bureaucratics. And not only that, but now they've combined the diplomats with the other members of the Foreign Service, right, in the same orientation. Language training is great at FSI, but then tradecraft, so if you are a new career foreign service officer and your first assignment will be in a political section or economic section at somewhere abroad, because almost all new US foreign service officers go abroad for their first assignment. So if you have an assignment in the political or economic section, you get 3 weeks of a course, combined political, economic, tradecraft in 3 weeks. Come on. And our entry system is such that the emphasis is on diversity, right? It's not on qualifications or skills to practice, to perform the daily duties of diplomacy. And diversity is great, and I think it's an asset for the Foreign Service to have people who used to be journalists or art gallery directors, or we've had even parole officers in the prison system. We've had lawyers and business people and finance people and military people, right? So great diversity, but where do there is no basis, there's no foundation from where everybody starts. Okay, so the culture in diplomacy for decades, if not centuries, has been that it's only on-the-job training. And this is out of a, I think, misguided belief that diplomacy cannot really be taught in a classroom setting, that you have to experience it. And so observing what others are doing and then doing it yourself, hoping that someone, a senior officer, will mentor you, and then learning by osmosis. That has been the practice globally of how diplomacy is being done, and winging it. I mean, to this day, and I'll the last point on this slide, right? There has never been an accepted body of knowledge or a codified sort of codified best practices. In other words, doctrine, like what the military has in military doctrine. There's never been anything remotely similar in diplomacy. So it's all over the place. How you do something. Why this way may have been better than the other way. It's just, I think it's really boring. That's why I say wing it, because it's on autopilot. I think diplomacy is on autopilot. Okay, so the book that Asaf mentioned is the new one that recently came out of Cambridge University Press. And the reasons, what I just talked about are some of the reasons that I wanted to have this book out, because for our own purposes at our academy, we need a text. We need, before we even begin a course, for our trainees to have a foundation. And this summer was the first time we actually had a course that took place after the book came out. And it made a huge difference. Essentially, it meant that we could spend so much more time in simulations and other practical exercises, because, as you know, that's how you learn best, right? Okay, let me go. All right. So to move to the skills that are the purpose of this workshop or webinar, I just wanted to review a couple of things, because if you ask 7 people what diplomacy is, they'll probably give you 6 or 7 different answers. And so, there has to be a baseline of some sort. And so, I'm not assuming that this is new to any of you, because obviously you have plenty of experience in the field. But I just wanted to show you how I think of this. So then hopefully that will make more sense when I get to the skills and the ideas that I wanted to share in terms of teaching them in academia. The 2 main sets of duties of managing relations with other states, whether bilateral or multilateral, and then at the same time carrying out your country's foreign policy, right? These are the basics. Now, the next couple of slides are just an example of how we introduce our trainees to the skill sets. And that begins with, first of all, understanding precisely what diplomacy is and what its place is in statecraft, and naturally also in a bureaucracy, right? Because diplomacy doesn't exist on its own, and it certainly can't succeed on its own. So I begin with the national interest, sort of, again, from outside in, right? Zooming in. The big thing, and then getting down to the skills and the daily conduct of diplomacy. So I begin with the national interest, which I don't want to spend much time on this, and I'm sure all of you are teaching it in probably not quite the same way. But to me, the national interest comes down to security and prosperity, if I have to make it very broad. And then in some cases, values, right? Some countries don't care about values in their foreign policy or national interest. Some do. So from there, I go to national security, right? Because national security has two main components of domestic and international or foreign, right? Domestic for law enforcement, whatever, immigration, or homeland security. And naturally, of course, we focus on foreign. So, in other words, in that whole framework of national interest, national security, then the two branches of national security or components, as I said, domestic and foreign. And then in the foreign component, right, of course, is foreign policy. And then in the foreign policy toolbox are the different tools or instruments. And I think diplomacy should be the tool of first resort. Most people, I think, agree. Maybe some don't. And of course, we have intelligence, we have the use of force or the military, and then we have these other trade, commerce, trade, investment, we have development, foreign aid, culture, and other tools, of course. But historically, the three main tools, of course, are diplomacy, intelligence, and the military. So the reason I have these slides is to, and of course, you all know that, but it's important for our trainees to know the difference between foreign policy and diplomacy, because very often in the media, in the public, in society, the two terms are used interchangeably, which of course is inaccurate, right? Diplomacy is one tool to carry out foreign policy. And there are different dictionary definitions of diplomacy, and you've heard about this, what is it? Diplomacy is a way to send someone to hell in such a way that they ask for directions, right? Or look forward to the journey, whatever. So it's all nice and whatever, but for practical purposes, we have to have a workable, pragmatic definition of diplomacy when we talk about professionalizing it. And so it is a profession. Well, I believe it is a profession, but it's also an activity that happens every day, right? Managing international relations with measures short of war. At the same time, this tracks back to my earlier slide about what diplomats do, right? Managing foreign relations and carrying out the foreign policy of their government. As the previous slide showed, a key tool, right? Hopefully the tool of first resort in implementing the foreign policy of the government. And from that on, diplomatic tradecraft is the set of skills, duties, and responsibilities, which is, I did all of this sort of in a way in my foreword to the book, just to get to defining tradecraft and then components of tradecraft and the main aspects of tradecraft. Okay, so let's now get to let's see how much time we have. Okay, to the meat and the substance. Now, I believe these are the main skill sets. These are the core skill sets of the work of daily diplomacy. Now, many of you teach things like policy analysis. Of course, research is a key part of any work in this field in academia. Communication, of course, there are degrees in various types of communication, including cross-cultural communication. So, as I said earlier, some of it you can learn in academia, right? And you know how you teach it, and you know what skills and competences students have once they graduate. But there's still, aspects of that cross-cultural communication, judgment, and creativity, and interpersonal skills that are quite different, and then a big part of them is very specific, and that is because of the nature of diplomacy, both as a profession and a way of life, right? Diplomacy isn't just a profession; it is a way of life, because people spend their life, their career, often in countries that are thousands of miles away. Not always, depends. For Americans, most of them are thousands of miles away. And the American Foreign Service is also kind of particular because most US Foreign Service officers spend most of their career overseas, and that is certainly not the case in other countries. In some countries, career diplomats may sort of spend half and half in capital and abroad, and in many cases, it's mostly in capital and a few years abroad. In any case, when you are abroad, it is a way of life because you represent your government, your country. It's really, you are always on the job in a way, right? and your family is affected by this, the way that your spouse or your partner lead their lives. Can they work? Can they find a job in that country? Can they work remotely? What about the kids? Are they adaptable? Can they make friends easily? Do they hate moving around every 2 or 3 years or so? So this all affects the work of career diplomats, and talking about managing people or interpersonal skills. It's very different to manage someone in your hometown. If you work for any company or a non-profit, right? If your employees go to work, go home every night to be with their families, that's one thing. If your employees go home in an apartment that's rented by the government, right, in a country that's not their own, thousands of miles away from the rest of their family, right, that's in a country they don't know, that's certainly different. So I wanted to focus on a couple of the skill sets, beginning with empathy, because I think I know personally over 1,000 American Foreign Service officers. I think those who really have command of empathy as the basis of diplomacy, right? The empathy for the views of others, I think, is the basis of diplomacy, or should be. So I probably can count on, let's say, on both my hands, the people in the US Foreign Service that I believe have mastered that skill. Right, that's how difficult it is. And just talking about, everybody thinks they understand empathy and what the difference between empathy and sympathy, but actually deploying the skill in diplomatic work is very different from everyday exchanges with people or engagement with people, right? Figuring out a way to understand where a foreign country or society or a foreign government is coming from when making decisions and taking certain actions, and then using that knowledge to align their interests with your own country's interests, which you represent or you should be representing, is very difficult. I don't know that this can be learned in academia, but perhaps with practical exercises, it can, right? With very specific cases. And this is in fact what we do at our academy. We use case studies from real life, because all our instructors are former career ambassadors, and a couple of current ones from time to time, but mostly former, with 30 to 40 years of experience. And so they will use cases that actually happen in real life and give a case like that as an assignment to the class is typically divided into groups. And so, because we try to simulate as much as we can the situation at an embassy, for example. And then after the groups have completed the assignment, then the ambassador will tell them what happened in real life. And not always what happens in real life was the correct course of action, right? But now, with the benefit of hindsight, the ambassador can judge what the mistakes were and how they could have been corrected at the time or after the fact, and all that. So when we talk about empathy, this does not imply agreeing with anyone, right? Agreeing with a foreigner or another government or any of that. It just goes to the ability of a diplomat, or hopefully more than one, right? The ability of the diplomats working on a problem, and their superiors back at headquarters, hopefully, right, their political leaders or whoever they may be, having the ability to understand and digest, or put themselves in the shoes of the other government, right, and then realizing, oh, that's why they're doing this, or that's why they want to do this, okay, then how do we turn this around? How do we dissuade them from doing this, right? And now let's go back and try to figure something out in their own background, history, mentality, decision-making process, bureaucracy, whatever it might be, right? Let's find something. And sometimes we may have to change their perception of their own circumstances, right? So example with Putin in Ukraine, right? I'm not saying it's easy or anything. I'm just giving it as a current example, right? If someone manages to change Putin's perception of his own circumstances, that could make a difference. Now, sometimes you may have to even rearrange the circumstances themselves, not just the perception of them. This is a very difficult skill, right? And yes, I agree that much of diplomatic mastery can only be achieved through practice, but there is no excuse for not having a baseline, or whatever you call it, body of knowledge, doctrine, codified best practices. In terms of the analytical skills, the difference here from possibly what some of you may be teaching is, again, the circumstance. You are in a foreign country, right? Since, let me see, I want to go to the next slide. Yes, okay. So these two slides are sort of combined, or they converge, because when we talk about skills, we have to talk about duties, and I do want to finish in by 45 past the hour, which would be almost halfway through. Hopefully you remember this. I can come back to this, but my point is, some of the skills that perhaps some of you teach, communication, analytical skills, cross-cultural communication, advocacy, negotiation, right? There's still a big part of those competencies that you have to be trained in if you want to work successfully in diplomacy, and that's connected to, of course, the duties. And so let me go through these quickly, and then I'll try to meld them all together to make more sense. Not that, and hopefully I'm already making sense, but okay. So to me, these, the three, there is four, but there are four, but I'll make a point about that in a minute. So clearly everybody knows, right? Diplomats represent their country and their government. Right? Protecting your fellow citizens in that country, of course, is, at least on paper, the main responsibility that the State Department says that its embassies have. And then, in terms of managing the relationship with the host country, the main aspects of that are, as I said earlier, navigating the society, trying to navigate. It's not enough to read the media, the press, right? You can do this from anywhere in the world these days, right? It is, how do you help your own government make the best policy concerning your host country, right? And you do it through feeding information or reporting to headquarters about what is happening, analyzing it, and trying to make sense about what it means for your country, and if you should do something about it or not. So earlier with the skills, when I mentioned analytical skills, so this is the difference, right? You're in a foreign country, you have to have reliable sources. You have to have the ability to gather accurate and up-to-date information. This is, I was going to talk about this later, but anyway, it's fitting to do it here. now we also getting into the field of trying to sort through huge amounts of information, and some already doing it with AI, right? To detect trends and other helpful patterns that might be useful to your headquarters. Then you have to write this mostly in diplomatic cables, but sometimes memos and other documents. Okay, so you're trying to understand what's happening, sort of navigate the society, figure out how it works, what makes it tick, right? Get to know the right people, and then make sure that your headquarters is informed correctly about what is happening in the host country and what it means. You're also trying to influence the policies and actions of the host government, as I said before, and then you're advocating for your home country's position and policies. Now, this this doesn't come naturally to most people, I think, right? I mean, you graduate from college, and are you ready to advocate for your country's positions and policies, even if you disagree with them? That is the job. Keeping the mission running, I put this in because unless the embassy staff are happy, or at least reasonably happy, you're not going to get good work out of them, right? If they don't have a fast internet connection, if everything in the mission isn't working properly, if they live in dumps, right? If their children are miserable at school, that will affect the work of the diplomat. Okay, so let me just go. So a quick back to the skills. All right. In terms of interpersonal skills I'm managing, I talked about the specificities about working in a diplomatic mission. Managing programs is somewhat similar to doing so perhaps in the NGO sector. Because in fact, many of the American NGOs and nonprofits in Washington are contractors to the State Department, so there is some overlap there. The last point of working in the interagency, it's so important, and so few people can actually do it effectively, because at an embassy you have people from many agencies, and it depends how big an embassy is and what country you represent, because of course the US Embassy in London has over 30 agencies represented, other than the State Department, and a few others, like the biggest ones. And that is a skill that has to be taught. I'm sorry, nobody is born with the skill or ability to work in the interagency, and that means that the foreign policy of your country should be the same for every agency. In other words, different agencies should not be carrying out different policies, right? You will be on the same page. You want to speak with the same in one voice, with one voice, and it's so difficult, so difficult. You see the chapter, I think it's chapter 5 in the book, about how an embassy works. It's just there's very specific cases and stories about successes and failures, in fact, and how difficult it is, not only during office hours with work, but also in people's personal lives, because your lives are not personal, especially if you are the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission, or the ambassador. You know everything about your employees, right? Who sleeps with whom, who drinks, who does whatever. It's just all, often it's nothing. Okay, and in terms of, just to give you an idea for those of you who may not know, in fact, one of the people who gave us a blurb, okay, I didn't have anything to do with it, but Cambridge had reached out to a few people, and some academics, some practitioners, and there's a blurb in the front of the book from a professor in, I forget what school it was, I think in Alabama, Richard Jordan, Baylor University. Okay. And he makes the point that, at least speaking for himself, but he says for many of his colleagues in academia, that not many of them actually know what happens in an embassy on a daily basis. So this is the American model. It's similar in many countries, particularly the big ones and the important ones. But the smaller the embassy, the fewer of those sections you'll have. So political economic, sometimes it's a combined political economic section. Public diplomacy sometimes is a separate section, sometimes it's just one person or half a person, meaning that maybe they have split responsibilities for political and public diplomacy work. Consular, we all know what that is, right? Visas, citizen services, passports and all that. Administration, which is now called management in the US Foreign Service. And so the first five, for those of you who don't know, the first five, political, economic, public diplomacy, consular, and management, are the 5 career tracks in the US Foreign Service for Foreign Service officers. Right? So you have to select one of those when you apply to join the Foreign Service. And then with security, these 6 sections make up the State Department employees at an embassy. And then the rest are other agencies, and just a sample. There are many others, right? And the difficulty, of course, is that those agencies or the representatives of those agencies have their own superiors back in Washington that they report to and they take orders from. But the people at the embassy who are representing those agencies, for the most part, have either never worked at an embassy before, or this may be their second time working at an embassy. And their superiors back in Washington probably have never worked at an embassy, possibly even haven't stepped foot at an embassy, right? And then you have also the ambassador that you're supposed to report to. And there is just inherent tension there that's just very difficult to overcome. So let me give you, in the last couple of minutes, before we move to something different from a monologue, examples of skills that I think, in fact, can be taught in academia. The first one, I mean, there are. It's useful. I don't know that you would want to necessarily do that, but the point here I had in mind was, before you go out to a new country, there are quite a few things and steps you can take to prepare yourself, most of which your government won't do for you. They won't just give them to you. You'll have to yourself to schedule your meetings with people at headquarters or people at the embassy of that country in your country, right, before you go out. And familiarize yourself with the people currently at the embassy, with the host government and all that. So I won't spend much time on this. I think in terms of diplomatic reporting and writing, that I think that clearly can be taught. And it's amazing how little of that is done right now. And then I also already talked about finding and analyzing information, cultivating sources and all that. The daily communication with the host government is based mainly on these 2 forms of diplomatic communication. There are others. Diplomatic notes, which are the most common, and delivering demarches. And a demarche is something that you do in person, and you do it orally, although you can leave a piece of paper behind you, which may be a non-paper. And it is essentially either a request or demand to the host government, or sometimes it may be just explanation of your country's position on something. Clearly, I mentioned advocating for policies that you may not agree with. That absolutely, I believe, can be taught, although some people just inherently cannot do it, which means that they should not become diplomats. And I know some of you teach negotiations. Well, I assume I don't know because I don't know who is in the room. And so negotiation is taught across the board. But for me, the issue always is your students will never have to do the negotiations that maybe they're being taught for many years. In other words, they learn about these very high-level negotiation, high stakes, right? And the reality is that in their first 5 or 10 years, they will be doing sort of much more mundane negotiations, which are not unimportant, right? I mean, a citizen of your country dies in the host country. You need to know the right people in hospitals, maybe in the city morgue, right? You have to you have a VIP coming in who wants to meet with the head of the Senate or the Speaker of Parliament, whatever it might be. You need to know the right people because you've got 48 hours to arrange a full schedule for this visiting VIP. So these are all sort of quick day-to-day negotiations. Sometimes I know people who from while the plane is in the air, they are on the phone from the airport negotiating with the host government or the mayor of the capital something that maybe how to stage the press conference, whether they'll be standing or sitting, whether there'll be questions from the press of both the host country and the home country and all that stuff. So anyway, you get and so I will finish and we can discuss any of that. I just wanted to point you to this was something that I hope will benefit some of your students. And we have every year in the summer, which is the only time current students, whether undergraduate or graduate, can take to come to Washington and do something outside of their regular college experience or master's degree experience. And this is a program we've been doing now for 7 years. It is a sort of a flagship program. And the book will give you a very good idea what it is we teach. Because what I did was sort of very superficial in a way, just because I have 45 minutes and we started at 11:05. And I mean, I started, so I think I kept my word to myself to do this for no more than 45 minutes. So here I stop and get rid of the slides. And yes, I'll start back to you.
Thank you, Nicholas. This was really interesting, really insightful. I've got a few questions already to ask you, but before I start, can I please encourage anyone who has any questions to ask, please use either the Q&A function or the chat box. And there's already one question. I'll just read it out for everyone. See, they're coming thick and fast. So the first question, what do you think about the idea of digital diplomacy and the role of academia in this context?
So the various aspects of diplomatic practice that I didn't mention all of them just because of time. And in fact, in the book, we have a chapter on science and health diplomacy, on cyber diplomacy. Digital diplomacy, I mean, I don't consider it a separate field. You cannot do diplomacy without digital diplomacy today, right? So there's a big difference between digital diplomacy and cyber diplomacy. To me, cyber diplomacy is a subfield, no question, which is why we have a chapter. And it was in fact written by, it's an edited book, that chapter was written by the Estonian ambassador at large for cyber diplomacy, who had the job for several years, and she's actually back in government now trying to help Ukraine in the field. But really, the tools of digital diplomacy you cannot avoid. You cannot do proper diplomacy or effective diplomacy today without as many of those tools as possible. So I don't separate it as like I do cyber diplomacy. And in terms of how different diplomats master those skills, I think it's time they audit. And of course, the older guard may be less open to learning new things because they've been in the Foreign Service for 30 or more years, right? But hopefully they have people who will help them with that, or will just do whatever needs to be done. That said, I think everyone is still learning how to use those tools.
Thank you. So we have another question. What are the main skills or areas of expertise and knowledge that, in your opinion, students should be trained in if the goal is to prepare them to become citizen diplomats? I believe that you touched on it a little bit. So if it's okay, I'd just like to expand on it just a little bit. When you mentioned key diplomatic skills, such as empathy and communication skills in particular, or intellectual curiosity, to what extent can you really teach someone to be a person of empathy? Or to what extent these are skills that, we are born with and we develop them in our formative years? Or is this something that we can really learn from, from a course, from a training, from a webinar, from a textbook. So to what extent some of these diplomatic skills we are born with them rather than, we can be trained in them, if you like.
Yes. Okay. So citizen diplomats are a different thing for me. I'm focusing on professional diplomacy here. I'm all for citizen diplomats, but they don't have on their shoulders what career diplomats have on their shoulders, right? When it's your job to protect and promote your country's interests, that's to me very different thing. And we should give you all the resources you need to accomplish what your task is. It's sure, as we know, the more citizen diplomats, the better. But I have to pick a focus for my work. And that said, clearly, those skills, the more of those skills citizens diplomats have, the better. But the whole point of my work is that there are things you have to do as a professional diplomat that you don't do anywhere else, because just the environment is so different, right? And I mean, how many people have stepped foot at an embassy out of all our citizens, right? So you can be a citizen diplomat without ever having stepped foot at an embassy, and that's fine, right? But in terms of the skills, again, it's nice to know how to communicate across cultures as a person, as any citizen, right? It'll absolutely enrich your life, will hopefully improve your quality in terms of your work and make you a better human being. But again, your country's interests don't depend on that. As a citizen diplomat, you're not going to have to write diplomatic cables, right? Because who else does that? That said, the skill of coherent, to the point, crisp writing cannot be overstated, right? Everyone should know how to do it. Whether you're writing a cable or a memo or an opinion piece for a newspaper or whatever it might be. And this is unfortunately one of the skills that I see the young generation are failing at. I mean, they will say something that I can say in one sentence, they will say it in 3 sentences, right? So they'll beat around the bush, right? They're not clear. When you write a memo to a senior official, you can't just go around and just, introduction, this is not academic writing, right? You have to go to the point from the beginning, because your boss doesn't have time to read more than a page or page and a half, right? And so I think from what I've seen, many, if not most of the people currently at that age, of college age, fail at providing a piece of writing that is well written. Of course, has to be grammatically written, and there are some problems there too. But more important, I think, is the utility of what you're writing for the audience you're writing it for. And I agree that whether you are an actual diplomat at an embassy, well, again, that more important in that case, or a citizen diplomat who works for a foundation or the headquarters or the State Department or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a country, absolutely, it's an essential skill. And today, with the acronyms, the abbreviations, the incomplete sentences that many of us use to communicate in chats and in text messages and all that, really has been detrimental to proper expression in a professional manner. I see very intelligent and clever young people, when it comes to writing, it's like, why did you write the sentence like a 9-year-old? Come on, you're 22. Anyway, so yeah, I'm agreeing. I'm just trying to make the point that I haven't, just in my work, because I have to make choices. My work isn't about citizen diplomats. It's about career diplomats. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question from India. Must a diplomat have a good PR skills? Because here in India, diplomats, the way they appear, it does not feel related to the majority of the population. So, and I don't think it's just the case in India, but for many, the the idea of a diplomat sounds very elitist, sort of, sort of Vienna Congress kind of diplomacy, if you like. So to what extent this is still the case, do you think? And to what extent having good PR skills is a necessary trait in modern diplomacy?
This is a very important aspect of diplomacy in this century, and unfortunately, even even diplomats who specialize in public diplomacy are often not great at public speaking, engaging with a foreign audience, and it's because they haven't done their homework, right? It's one of the reasons. In other words, you cannot go to another country and start speaking to an audience there without knowing who you're speaking to. In other words, at least the basics of the history of the country. Hopefully, if you are a diplomat assigned to that country for a few years, hopefully you'll know the language as well. But you have to know the history, the culture, the mentality, current events, right? What is currently the topic of conversation or concern for the public or a certain group of people, or the type of audience you're speaking to, which is why I always try to learn as much as I can about any audience I'm speaking to. So that's one, right? Preparation, doing your homework. Because again, the reality is, for some reason, governments don't care about training their diplomats. They just throw them into the deep end and hoping they'll figure it out, right? And so you'll have ambassadors who are terrible public speakers. And some are just boring. Others are even awkward, right? And now, can you train them? Sure. Some people respond to training better than others, right? With some people, you may give them 75 hours of training, they're not going to improve too much, right? Just because of how they carry themselves or the way they've decided that they should appear in public. In that case, I think before you are made an ambassador, right? The decision makers should think twice about even making you an ambassador, right? Because this absolutely is a key skill. I'll give you an example. We had an ambassador in London about more than 20 years ago, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, who was from Kentucky. He had absolutely no qualifications to be a diplomat. The only reason I was told he was sent, I was visiting at the embassy at the time, and I was told the only reason he was sent there was because, first of all, he was a friend of the Bush family, but also apparently he knew the Queen personally. That was enough. They didn't care what else he had or didn't have. He didn't want to do public events. The ambassador of the United States told his staff that he would not do public events. Why are we wasting our time, right? So again, I feel like I'm bad-mouthing people behind their back. I'm not mentioning names here. You can figure it out who that might be. But everybody knew it at the embassy, and everybody knew it in the Foreign Office in London, and people just well, it is what it is. We'll just have to live with it. So absolutely, PR skills. When you say that, it's a whole suite of skills, right? It's not, to me, public speaking is very important, and making a connection. Whether you are a public diplomacy officer or the political officer or any kind of even economic officer, if you're not able to make a connection with another human being, or hopefully more, right? But one-on-one is as important as it is when you're speaking to an audience of 100 or 1,000. Because Edward R. Murrow, who was an American journalist in World War II, and then afterwards became the first director of the U.S. Information Agency when it was created by President Kennedy in 1961. He used to say that the last 3 feet is the most important distance in diplomacy or in international engagement. The last 3 feet, meaning when you are sitting with the other person one-on-one, eye to eye, because that's when you probably will make the biggest difference. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree that also that that set of skills is not given enough priority in deciding not only whether one becomes a diplomat, but then deciding on assignments as people rise up the hierarchy and they become section chiefs and deputy chiefs of missions and chiefs of missions.
think this is a good follow-up question. How do you envision teaching these skills effectively? So other than simulations, for example, in the classroom, can you think of other particular methodologies or approaches that you would recommend?
Yes, again, in this time you can do not too much, but I would. I mean, I don't. This is not just to keep going back to the book, but the book, every chapter has at least one case study and then at least one exercise scenario at the end of the chapter. So it will give you an idea, for example, in public diplomacy, right? What kinds of things you might practice with your students. And even if you don't necessarily relate to something that happened at a US embassy somewhere, adapt it, right? Don't use our example. You find one that concerns your own country, right? Take one of our exercises, the scenarios we have for exercises, and change it a bit or a lot, right, to fit whatever the situation or the circumstances may be that will teach your students the best. But in terms of methodology, so the best that I can offer, and I'm just going to offer it as a suggestion, and I have thought about adding courses at our academy, sort of training the trainers, right? Maybe a course for professors, people who teach in academia, and we're open to doing that. I just haven't seen personally enough interest, because to make this work financially, we'll have to have significant interest to do it. Although we have to start small, I suppose. So we can actually offer courses, or what you're just asking about, these specific methodologies. We can actually do that. I don't know how many people will be willing to pay for it, because we can't do it for free. Nobody's giving us money. No, we have no funders from anywhere or sponsors for any of that. We just charge what we do, and that's how we survive. So to make it work financially, there will have to be some substantial interest. But in all aspects that I talked about today, political, economic, public diplomacy, consular, all of that, cyber diplomacy, science and health diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy, very important, of course, advocacy, negotiation, and all that, right, reporting and writing. We absolutely can train the trainers, right? We can do that with methodologies and specific, many more exercises than the scenarios we have in the book. Because we only had space for maybe 2 exercises scenarios after each chapter, but just to circle back to the question, in terms of methodologies, they have, in order to have an immediate effect on the trainee, I believe, these methodologies, or whatever you teach them, has to be directly linked to the actual duties of in the daily work, right? So that's why I spend so much time defining not just the skill sets, but also the duties and responsibilities. Because if you don't know what's expected of you, how do you know how to teach a student to do it well, right? And so in the abstract, you can talk about analysis or cross-cultural communication, but unless you're faced with a situation indicative of what you might encounter in real life, it's not going to have much of an effect. And I think there is enough already done in academia that is broader, more general, more theoretical, let's say, about many of these skills, right? Like policy analysis or cross-cultural communication, or other kinds of communication, or negotiation. That when you do a case study about the negotiations that ended the Vietnam War, or the first, or something more recent, for example, the conflict somewhere else, right? You are studying a very high level and high stakes negotiation. Yes, a lot of that your students can take away, but they are not likely to have to apply much of this until 20 years from now. when they are in those positions, that they can, in fact, they are in a position to do what people at that level do, right? At the beginning, the first 5 or 10 years of their careers, they'll be the assistants. They'll be the people drafting the papers, right? They will be the people making sure that this person is present, or they can be found, or you can get them on their cell phone, right? Or logistical things, perhaps research on the opposing team in the negotiation, right? These are the things that the entry-level people will have to do.
Thank you. Another question. There also seems to be a similar professionalization issue with peace mediation. Why do you think many governments anticipate that why do you think many governments anticipate that most anyone can do the job of a diplomat or a peace mediator? Is it because there's been a lack of research on the impact of individual diplomats and mediators?
I've been banging my head against a wall for for many years, trying to figure out, why do very intelligent and bright people like Obama think that you can take your friend from who's a partner in a law firm or some other place, and make them the special envoy for this or that, right, to resolve a conflict without any training. I don't know. I'm not in those people's heads. I honestly, it's beyond me. I just don't understand it, and that's why I spent over a decade writing, and I don't know who pays attention. In Washington, and not among you, but they keep doing it, and so I don't know what it will take to change those minds, right? Make them sort of see the light and realize that you can't just plug a lawyer from a law firm and make them a diplomat. It's just, I have nothing against people from outside. I actually believe that new blood is vital to diplomacy. I have no problem with political appointees as long as they're competent and qualified, right? And if they're not, then they should go intensive, substantial training before they start their job. It's just, right now we have certain, some envoys that we have a couple of career diplomats, but we also have some who are not. And they just jumped into the job thinking, oh, they'll just figure it out because they're smart, right? So it's certainly linked to what I mentioned before, which is just the perception out there in the public, and that diplomacy is just not. That's I don't think really most people think it's a real profession. I think it's just an activity that can be done by a variety of people, that you don't have to be necessarily trained in it. And in my head, what diplomats are supposed to do is as important, at least as important, possibly even more important than what your doctor does every day. Or maybe a lawyer you will pay $700 an hour or whatever. Or in DC, they charge $900 now an hour, right? So can you imagine trusting a lawyer who is learning on the job? Right? Would you pay even $200 to? I don't know. Or putting your health into the hands of a doctor who is training on the job. Yes, I know we have the interns and the residents and all that, but they have gone to school for years. And unlike diplomacy, there is a body of knowledge, right, that they have to learn and be and sit for exams before they move up, right, or move on, right? There's nothing like that in diplomacy, and so that's really the mission of my career now, is to make at least some strides. I don't know that I'll be still alive when, if at all, at some point, diplomacy in fact is recognized as a real profession, but at least make some strides and to make sure it's taken seriously.
Can I just follow up on that? To what extent do you think it's different from secretaries of defense or, not necessarily in the US, but certainly in Europe, who assumed this position without an extensive training and service in the security services in the army. And they come from the political world, so they're also political appointees. So to what extent do you think this is not necessarily unique to the realm of diplomacy? This is just a byproduct of, whatever you want to call it, modern politics or something else?
It's a reality of life in pretty much any country that ministers and secretaries, whatever we call them, will very often receive their jobs because of political connections or because they are a known name. Sometimes we call them in DC a known quantity. We don't say quality, we say quantity. And it is what it is, right? The president, at least in the United States, the Constitution gives the president the right to appoint anyone he or she wishes to his or her cabinet. And there's nothing you can do. Now, the Senate has to confirm or to approve those people. And there have been examples in history, including recent history, when the Senate has refused to approve a certain nominee. It happens rarely, but that's all they can do. Unfortunately, when the Senate has refused to approve someone, it's not because of lack of qualifications. It's because the person is controversial, right? Whatever, they said something at some point that it doesn't sit well with people now. Anyway, but that's exactly why it's so important for the career people under the secretary or the minister to be the best they can be, right? Because they're the institutional memory. They should have the skills. The Secretary of Defense, it would be great and absolutely helpful if he or she is familiar with the armed forces and the services we have, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, right, the Marines, the Coast Guard, absolutely. But the Secretary of Defense is a political position, and there is also the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So, right, and then each of the services has its own head, right? There's the Secretary of the Navy, of the Army, of the Air Force, right? And so what I'm saying is, since you mentioned defense, we have several layers of defense. At state, we don't. The Secretary of State really has the run of the place. Only the president can intervene, right? And I mean, the National Security Advisor, if you look at history, Zbigniew Brzezinski was very forceful in his disagreements with Cyrus Vance when they worked for President Carter in the 70s. And eventually Cyrus Vance resigned because he just was fed up dealing with Brzezinski. But the Secretary of State, in a way, has, he doesn't have the Joint Chiefs of Staff or an equivalent of that to deal with. So it's a fairly powerful position. That said, because so many agencies these days, not only the American government, but in most other countries, so many other agencies claim foreign policy turf, right? They want to be involved in foreign affairs, whether it's because the minister wants to travel more often or whatever, right? But look at, the energy. Energy is an international issue, right? Departments in the US government that had little to do in foreign affairs 20 years ago now are there on the front lines because all these issues have become sort of internationalized. And suddenly even, look, did any of you know that the US Forest Service has 3 representatives abroad? They actually have people stationed at the US embassies. The US Forest Service. The Library of Congress has a couple of people as well in certain, they position them in sort of, hopefully, strategically, wherever they're most needed. But that's why the civil servants, right, the career people, the public servants have to be well prepared and trained to do the job, because the head of the department or the minister may be, look at Pete Buttigieg, right, in the Department of Transportation. He didn't have, he was in the military, right? He served in Afghanistan and in other places. So he was a mayor of a town in Indiana, but he didn't have any transportation experience to speak of. He's done pretty well for someone who didn't have an experience, because he's willing to listen, right? And he's also willing to try new approaches in terms of the bureaucracy and innovation and all that. So, I mean, I don't know everything he's doing on a daily basis, but he seems to be much more active than many of his colleagues in the cabinet.
Thank you. One more question. How do you see the interrelation between the private sector and diplomacy? And can you suggest some resources that would be useful for people in the private sector to understand diplomacy for building their skills and applying in their work?
Very important question, and so I can't possibly say everything I want to say in a couple of minutes, but that's why we have a course for the. So we just actually finished one in September. We have a 2-week online. We do it online, but the other courses we do are either hybrid or in person. This one we've kept online even after COVID, because people from different countries join in. And also, it's 3 hours a day, which means that many of them can still work the rest of the day. So it's much easier logistically to do it online. Anyway, absolutely, many of the skills in diplomacy can be used, and I think should be used in the private sector. I mean, no question. Now, you're not going to have to write diplomatic cables, but this whole the concept of empathy and realigning, right, the interests of the other side, and rearranging the perception of their circumstances or the actual circumstances. This is all absolutely in international business very, very pragmatic to have, right, as a skill, and very sort of as a utility. If you look at an office abroad of a fairly big company, take I don't know, Apple or Google or whatever, right? Look at their office in Brussels or in Hong Kong now. Many of them are leaving Hong Kong, but moving to Singapore. But so let's say Singapore or whatever, or Sao Paulo or Brasilia, wherever they are. If you look at sort of the average office of a multinational company in another country, in a country other than the country in which the company has its headquarters, that office has many similarities with the consulate, right? I used to say, before more recent developments in Hong Kong, I used to say, go to a multinational American company in Hong Kong and look at their office, look at the staff, look at what they're doing, and then compare that to what the US consulate in Hong Kong is doing. You will see quite a bit of similarity in that. And absolutely, these when you are as a employee of a private company posted abroad, you most likely have to deal with the government. After all, that's probably the main reason you're there to begin with. And if you don't know how to do this, if you know what buttons to push, if you don't know how to find the right people, if you don't know how to deal with those people, where are you going to go? How far are you going to go? Right. So absolutely, it's well, that's why we spend 2 weeks, 3 hours a day, right, doing this in this particular course. That I want to make sure that all of you actually have my contact information, and so I can put it in the
chat
box,
maybe, Nicolas.
I can put it in the public chat, or so someone can share it. If I'll. It's just so our website is as you saw on the last slide. It is diplomaticacademy.us, and my email is just first initial and last name, so nkralev@diplomaticacademy.us. But this is the public chat, webinar chat, yes. I'm typing it, academy.us. Okay, diplomatic. I spelled it correctly, I think. So if any of you want to reach out, as some did when we did a webinar with Cambridge a few months ago, and some of them reached out to me, and so I thought it was useful to do that. Anyway, any last
Yeah, I
question?
think we might have time for one or two more. Some of these questions are quite long, so please forgive me. I will just try to summarize them because we have too much of time. This is, I think, a really interesting question. How do you train diplomats on dealing with postings where politics do not align in practice with the normative values espoused in the home country, at least in theory, particularly in relation to sort of West, non-West binaries?
This is an area where many countries actually do focus. So we call it area studies, right? If you are going to work in Central Europe, you're going to take a course at the Foreign Service Institute about the sort of the politics or the current affairs in Central Europe. When I attended one of those sessions, it was a person at a think tank in Washington who taught that session specifically about Central Europe. The problem with how they do it is that the person isn't a diplomat. The person is an expert in the area, in the region, right? In whatever, West Africa, Southeast Asia, whatever. The person typically who teaches the session is a scholar or a think tank person. They're not diplomats. They've never worked at an embassy. Most of them don't know how an embassy works or what the different sections do. So again, when I listened to that person at the time, I thought, I can learn this by just reading online. I can find this information in many other places, which in fact was one of the reasons that when I started our academy, I was very determined not to teach what people can learn elsewhere. Right? Even in the book, I've put things that you cannot find anywhere else because they come from experience. Right? And it's all now you can read about the history of the countries in Central Europe since World War II. Absolutely, you can do it. You can focus even on the country where that particular diplomat will be going, and hopefully they're doing it themselves. But okay, so what? I always ask the question: so what? Why do you need to know that? Because there's so much to know, and there is so much you can know on the tip of your your fingertips with on your phone, right? But why do you need to know that specific thing? And how would it help you in your work? That is, for me, the bottom line. And so when you take a course or a session on the politics of a region, okay, so, right, so what? And I don't think this is done these days in really any country, as far as I know. It's essentially left to the individuals to do it for themselves, right? They take a session. I've been to many diplomatic institutes or whatever they call them, in Sweden, in Portugal, in Chile, in Prague, and many other countries, in Peru a year ago, less than a year ago. And they seem to have so many of their teachers who are not diplomats. And I honestly can't understand that either. I remember this is a few years ago now, but I was in Lisbon there at the ministry, and their institute was very small at the time. I don't know what it's like now, but and I asked them, do you have so who teaches these sessions, these courses? And they say, well, we hire professors from the university. Okay. What about senior diplomats teaching junior diplomats? Oh, we can't afford that because they need it to do the job. What does this mean? We don't have enough diplomats, right? Going back to my first slide, we don't have. So it's all it's all connected. It's all absolutely to have a training. Forget that I don't want to forget the teachers, but it's both the people who teach and then the people who are taught. In other words, to take time off to do a course at your ministry or whatever that you can take it, or your diplomatic institute, you need to be away from your job for a week or two or whatever it is, right? And the reality is that your boss just most likely won't let you go for that long because they need you on the job because there is work to be done, right? And again, this means that not enough diplomats. Even with all the thousands of people we have in the US Foreign Service, there are dozens of embassies in Africa and other hardship places. that have been chronically understaffed for years and years and years. I mean, I would say even for decades. We always have positions open, and there are not enough people to fill them. How then can you make the case that this person in some other country can take 2 weeks to come back to Washington to go to the Foreign Service Institute to take a course or something? Right? Very difficult. I mean, it happens, but it's very, very difficult.
Thank you. I believe we're just about out of time now. We have just under a minute. So first of all, I'd like to thank you, Nicholas, for joining us today. I thought it was extremely insightful and really engaging talk. So thank you for that. Thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone for joining us today and for asking us such great questions. My apologies for not being able to field all of them. We simply ran out of time, but you do have Nicholas's email if you'd like to follow it up with him later. I believe that a link to this webinar will be shared with everyone who's registered for this event over the next week or so. And other than that, again, thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you soon in our forthcoming DPLST webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Swell. And I do want to encourage those of you who teach in academia, think about teaching courses in diplomacy, right? In practical diplomacy, not diplomatic studies, because there are quite a few of those, but just, and I know it takes quite a bit to create a new course and get it approved through the bureaucracy in academia, but I would be very happy to see more courses. And in fact, I'm also looking for a sort of test case. I'd love for our academy to partner with a university or two, maybe one in the US and one in Europe, to create a master's program in diplomatic practice. And we can do 1 year in academia at the university and then 1 year with us. So people still get the requirements that are required to do a Master of Science or whatever it might be. And then they'll also graduate with actual skills that can be used in their actual work. So yeah, thanks again. And
well, I look forward to having this conversation with you in Birmingham in a few weeks' time. So
all right,
absolutely. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. See you soon.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.